Ted the Caver, Part 3.
February 13th. It's amazing what a good couple meals and a little sleep can do for someone's attitude. Even though we still had the memories of the strange noise fresh in our minds, we relit our fire of enthusiasm. The other side of the passage seemed so close. We were sure this would be the day. We got to the cave and started our way back down the hole. Getting back into the darkness of the cave brought back the memories of the night before. The sight of the circle of rock illuminated by our headlamps, the smell of dirt in the air, and the sound we made as we crawled across the rock. Once we reached the entrance to Floyd's tomb, however, we were once again ready to blaze the trail leading to an undiscovered part of the cave. Immediately noted the presence of the breeze blowing out of the hole and the rumbling. The bullpen sticking out of its hole was an obvious sign of where we needed to begin work for the day. B took over where he left off before. I'd look up the residue in the same spot I occupied the night before. Even though I was already well rested and wanting to start work, B was making the hammer sing with each blow. After a mere 2 or 3 minutes he had let out a cheer. He turned to reveal a handful of rock that used to be attached to the cave. He was breathing heavily, but he had a large smile on his face. So did I. For the time, the strange noise had been forgotten, and a vision of success captured our attention. The lower left-hand corner of the hole had been giving us grief because of the thickness of the wall at that point. We felt that if we could just remove that corner, we might be on our way inside. B now held in his hand the crumbled remains of the corner. Our excitement consumed us as we examined the hole. I took the hammer and pounded away at the surface of the hole. The idea was to remove any jagged edges that would take their toll on my skin. The size looked right now, the moment we had been working for. I cautiously approached the entrance to Floyd's tomb. I decided the best way to enter the small hole was to place one arm over my head, turn my head sideways, and slowly work my way in. I soon determined that this was not going to work. The hole was still very small. If I was going to make it without widening the hole anymore, I was going to have to put both arms over my head in diving position, turn my head sideways, and slip into the tomb. The width of the entrance was the limiting factor. The height was sufficient. The arms overhead position flared my shoulder blades out, but there was still room to get in. Plus, the arm overhead gave me the best squeeze to the side. In order to enter straight into the hole, I stood on my feet and bent over to get level with the entrance. My knees were bent and the position was uncomfortable, sort of a semi-squatting position, bent at the waist with the arms overhead. Plus, I had to slightly turn my upper torso to the left in a counterclockwise rotation to negotiate the angle of the entrance. Notice in the last photo that the entrance generally slopes up to the right. I got my arms around the entrance with minor scrapes. Next came my head, but keeping it turned sideways I was able to get in, for the most part up to my shoulders. When I got to my shoulders, I could feel all the rocks touching around my shoulders and chest. It was not stopping me though, but I was definitely scraped on many surfaces of my body. I decided to just push through, keeping in mind that I would have to go there and come back out eventually. The pain was not too bad, and I was in, while my upper body was in. At least I could get a good idea of what the tomb was going to be like. Once inside the tomb, I had a few inches all around me on which to position my body. This was the largest part of the passage, and it was conveniently located right at the beginning of the crawl. That gave me a little room to get positioned to crawl further inside the passage. Inside the tomb gave me a whole new outlook of what it was going to be like to crawl through. Even though this was the largest part of the crawl, it was still very small. I could only move my head around, but every direction that I turned I was staring at a wall of solid rock. When I spoke to B, my voice sounded muffled, like I was talking into a small box. I could now rest my head on the passage floor, but the rocks were uncomfortable. I turned my head to look further ahead, but I couldn't see past the walls of rocks I had built the day before. The squeeze toward the end of the passage was closer now, and appeared even narrower. I didn't know if I could squeeze through or not. I knew it would be close. I wanted to crawl further into the passage. First, however, I had to work to get some of those loose rocks out of the way that were lying on the passage floor. I was disappointed to find that most of the rocks that looked loose were actually attached to the floor. I was hoping just to be able to scrape them out of the way. I had pushed the sledgehammer into the passage before me, so I used it to push the rock wall we had made further back into the passage. Then I dragged the sledge back and forth across the floor to move any loose rocks, or to break up the solid ones. By sliding the head of the hammer under the squeeze, I determined that the narrowest part of the squeeze was about 7 inches high. I figured that we would have to do some more work before I could slip through it. The entire time I had my head in the passage, B was just kicking back, listening to my descriptions and my progress reports. At some point he snapped the photo shown here, thanks B. Up to this point, the size of the passage was not too big of a deal. I was in an incredibly small passage, but only my upper body was in, since it was the largest part of the passage, and my arms could move freely. I was pretty calm. Then it was time for a push. I slid the sledge up as far as I could reach. Since my body filled the entrance, I could not slip the tool out, so it was much easier to push it ahead. In order to rotate my hips to the proper angle to enter the hole, I had to lean my upper body on my forearms, use my feet to climb the wall outside of the hole, and slowly crawl into the hole. My hips barely fit. Once they cleared the entrance, I could relax a bit and get into position to work around the squeeze. I decided to use the one-arm forward technique to get through. The passage was so narrow that whatever position I started with, I would have to stay through the entire length. There was just no room to move around or change positions. I would also have to turn my head one way or another and keep it in the same position. This crawl was tight. Moving forward at this part of the passage was relatively easy. I could use my forward arm, my left arm, to pull and my other arm to push. At the same time, I would wiggle my body, trying to arch as much as I could to keep my chest off the rocks. I tried both ways and determined that I would turn my head to the right. It felt most comfortable, and I began to learn things as I went. I determined that a small flashlight in one hand would be nice, then I could shine it ahead and get a better idea of what I was going to crawl over. This was a difficult maneuver because I had to look overhead since my body was turned. I became immediately aware that we were going to have to do some work, removing rocks from the passage floor. As I moved along the surface, I was constantly scraping my chest to the rocks. They were sharp and very painful. Occasionally, I would cause a rock to slide under my chest, and occasionally wedge me between it and the top of the passage. I would then have to back up and either try to move the rock to the side with my chest, using a sweeping motion with my head, or back out and move it with my forward hand. My little trip in the passage represented a major milestone in my caving career. When I began caving, I did not feel overly comfortable going through tight squeezes. Even the little squeezes at the beginning of the cave was an obstacle to overcome. By pushing myself and forcing myself to try the narrow passages, I have become much calmer about tight spaces. Still, this passage represented a new benchmark in small spaces. I had not been faced with anything this small. I don't remember having to take off my helmet before now. With this passage, it is mandatory. As I mentioned before, not only do I have to take off my helmet, but I have to turn my head to the side in order to fit. My journey into the tomb went like this. After I had twisted my hips into the passage, it took a few minutes to stop and work out a game plan. Most of the length of my legs was still outside the entrance. They were just dangling in the air. The tomb was still big enough for me to move my head around, and even move my arms freely into position. It was larger than the rest of the passage, but not by much. It was like sticking your head into a box. Everywhere I looked there were rocks, and not too far away from my head, and any sound I made was muffled and dead. The narrowest part of the passage was about 10 feet in. At this point I was about 3.5 feet in. At about the 4-foot mark I would have to commit to whatever position I felt comfortable, and stay that way until the 12-foot mark where the cave started opening up. I went with my left arm forward and my head turned to the right. B had given me a flashlight that I held in my left hand. As I inched forward, I had tried to brush the loose rocks away with my left arm. This was somewhat successful, but there were a lot of rocks that I could have missed or not removed. As I mentioned, the first little bit of the crawl moved very quickly, since there was little room above the passage that allowed me to negotiate the passage. Then the wall started to close in around me. I had a few extra inches on each side of me, but the top of the crawl was getting very low. At about the 7-foot mark, I could feel the top rubbing on my back as I would arch. After another half-foot, I couldn't arch anymore. I just had to push ahead with my toes and pull my forward arm. I decided that it would be a better time to see if I could back out. I tried and it was pretty easy. That gave me a lot more confidence. Still, I had B tie webbing to my feet, just in case he would pull me out. My neck was starting to get sore from being cranked with. My head was getting heavy, but to rest it, the only option I had was to lay it down on the broken rocks. It was painful, but I still did it frequently. I was staring at the wall to my right. It was a mere 4 to 5 inches from my face. Most of the time, I wasn't even watching the wall. Either I had my eyes closed, which I sometimes do when I go through a tight spot, or the light wasn't shining in a direction that did me any good. It was very quiet inside the tube, other than my breath. I was starting to breathe heavy from the effort it took to move. Thankfully, the breeze was present and cooled me off. By lifting my head and carefully touching the ceiling from time to time, I could gauge the size of the passage that my body would soon pass through, much like a cat using its whiskers to gauge an opening in a fence. At the 7.5-foot mark, I could tell many things were about to get real tight. While lying in the darkness, in a passage deep within the cave, one is in a unique position to wander. A mountain literally resting on top of me, the entire earth lying below. One tiny movement of the earth and I would cease to exist. Or worse, to recognize the fear shared by Floyd Collins as he lay there, shrouded for days deep within the heart of Mother Earth, incapable of freeing himself from the earthen prison. Picture yourself in my position, laying on your stomach, your left arm is extended over your head, your arm is at your side, your right one, having only a few inches in which to move. Your arms and hands are sore and bleeding from crawling/pulling yourself across the broken rocks. Your entire body is resting on broken rocks. Your neck gets tired of holding your head off the rocks, so you gently rest your cheek on the broken rocks to rest. Once you start again, you have to push your toes to scoot your body forward, sliding across the rocks. After moving a few inches, you're breathing hard and have to rest. As you inhale, you can feel your back pressing hard against the top of the It takes several minutes before you can recover enough to press forward. The entire time you're lying there, you think about how you're going to get back out and what if. That's pretty much what I thought at that point in the passage. When I reached the point that my back was rubbing and I could feel my head in the passage getting bigger, I knew that I was most likely not going to get through. Still, I decided to give it one more push. I'd be in a state of panic, but not today. I was pretty pumped. It took a few minutes to rest. Then I went for it. I exhaled completely all of the air in my lungs. This caused my chest to collapse enough to scoot forward a few inches. Because it takes so much effort to scoot, I only went a few inches before I had to stop and breathe again. As I inhaled, my chest pressed hard against the floor and my back went against the top. It took a little longer to get my breath back. I only took a few extra minutes to enjoy this position. Small passage. Wow, I cannot believe how relaxed I was. I tried one more time to exhale and my back was rubbing too much to continue. Despite the failed effort, I was psyched. It took several more minutes to lay there and recover from the effort. B had been encouraging me this entire time. It was fun to hear him cheer as he saw my shoes go deeper and deeper into the hole. Backing out was not too difficult, but it did take some work. The same obstacles as when I came in. After I wiggled my hips out of the hole, which took some time, I had some trouble getting my shoulders out. Both arms were overhead at this point. My shirt was getting caught on the rocks and my shoulders were brushing the sharp rocks. After struggling to find a good position, I gave up and pulled my upper body out. My shirt pulled up over my head and I had some nice scrapes on my shoulders, but I didn't care. To me, this trip was a success. I pushed myself beyond what I thought was and thought, looked at the narrow passages I had just been in. The rock wall was at now the 11-foot mark. I had pushed a little bit with my forward arm. The smallest point was at the 9-foot mark. We were close. Between the work and the excitement, I was just tired. I just sat on the rope bag, grinning. What a trip.